Hello?
Hi, Alyssa.
Hey, hi.
Hi, it's Robert. I saw that you called, and it looks like we're having some crossed wires here with the session.
Yeah, it says, please wait, the meeting host will let you in soon. I'm waiting for the Zoom.
Yeah.
Do you see me waiting?
Just showed up. Okay. So here we go. Everyone should be coming in momentarily. Here we go.
Cool.
Okay. All right, so sorry for the delay. Were you trying to get in for a while?
I was in the Excel events link, and so I didn't know there was a Zoom in tandem with that. So I was just sitting in there waiting for something in there. Do I need that Excel events link open too for this?
At this point, no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because everything will get held here, and then it's only the attendees that will actually kind of see everything through the Excel events
okay.
portal.
Cool.
Okay, so this is a little bit simpler than hosting on the Excel events. You're probably familiar with the layout of Zoom by this point, right?
Yeah, yep, super easy. And
okay.
I'll be doing breakout groups towards the end. So do you want to set them up since you're a host, and it can be random, you know, however many people you think make sense, 4 to 5, to have a nice conversation for 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, okay. So just break it up into groups of 4 or 5?
Yeah, depending on how many people come, enough to have a nice conversation and whatever you feel like is balanced, Robert.
Okay, okay.
Hello, Suzanne Bowles.
I'm gonna make
following
you all right, I'm making you co-host, Alyssa, so that you can share your screen and
cool.
whatever else you'll need to do. Okay, so you should now see the extra options down at the bottom.
I do, I do.
And are you going to be doing a dedicated Q&A session, or are you just going to kind of field comments and questions as they arise during?
I'll just field it as it goes along.
Okay.
But towards the, I'll probably say if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and you know, towards the end of the session, we'll address any of those. And I'll keep an eye on it. So if any seem relevant as I'm going along, I can pause. But I should be good.
Ooh. All right, you froze. I'm not sure how much I missed.
Yeah, you froze for a moment too.
Okay.
And are you going to do a quick opening, Robert, to start kicking off?
That will be, you can kick it off and do your introduction. I'm just trying to check how our participant list is shaping up here. All right, so I'm going to go off of video.
Are people coming in through the waiting room? I can't hear you, Robert.
No, they're not showing up in the waiting room just yet. I need to check in Excel events to see if there's some sort of counter there.
Okay. I'm going to go on mute while we wait.
Okay. Okay, so we have a couple more people trickling in now, and I've confirmed in the Excel events how it's working on that end. So if you want to go ahead and get started within the next few seconds, feel free. I will jump out of here.
Okay, sounds good. Well, it looks like we have a small group of rock star humans joining this ready to start. So I'm excited to see you all. Welcome, Tori. Welcome, Suzanne. Welcome, Laura. And Robert, thank you from Maine Philanthropy Center for getting us going with the technology and hosting this conversation today. My name is Alyssa Wright, for those of you who don't know me. I am the principal at Wright Collective. We're a small boutique consulting firm based in York, Maine. So waving hello from beautiful Wabanaki lands down here today. And I've been in the philanthropy world for a little bit over a decade now. I've had the great gift and opportunity to play a variety of different roles in the space. And I thought it was a really important conversation for us to have today. We'll do some small breakout groups as folks kind of trickle in and come into the group today, or we'll have a main group discussion around some of these principles and how we really implement them and move them forward in our personal work and practice. So a few years ago, in 2019, Darren Walker wrote a book called From Generosity to Justice. It was a real look at the original, a book originally written by Andrew Carnegie called The Gospel of Wealth. And both books really look at how we use wealth to solve societal problems on scale, at scale. And so what we're going to be exploring today is a little bit of the history of philanthropy, talking about Darren's publication. Darren Walker, for those of you who don't know, is the head of the Ford Foundation. And we'll be diving a little bit into the nuances and complexities that surround our own work, whether you're arriving to today's workshop as a philanthropic advisor, as a program officer at a foundation or a corporate foundation, as a fundraiser out in the field, or as a consultant who's also moving through the world and seeking to make a difference in whatever role you play in social impact. So welcome and thank you for being here. Before I share my screen, and I see that we have Jesse now joining, Jess joining, awesome. Before I share my screen and get the conversation started, I think that many people would probably look at my LinkedIn or my resume or my bio and wouldn't know immediately from looking at that I have actually been on the receiving end of a lot of really generous donors and philanthropic programs to get to where I'm at today. And so you're hearing this conversation from someone who both personally, for many reasons, as well as professionally, wants to see the sector move more from a charity mindset to a real justice mindset in how they do the work that they do. Because I can't tell you how many times I was the scholarship kid on the receiving end of a lot of philanthropic programs. I was the one who was put on the stage to sort of make sure that donors knew the difference they were making, and to hear my story of how difficult my upbringing and my childhood was in a more rural part of Massachusetts where I grew up. And I have to tell you that for many, many years, I would watch people kind of high five themselves for helping lift someone like myself out of poverty, while they were also the people in our community who were making the decisions that prevented my family from in many ways, from actually being a part of the systemic change that our community needed so that we could afford housing, we could get jobs that were sustainable, we could get education that was necessary to us. And so instead of often getting access and opportunity to the things that could make a difference for me and my family, instead we were usually kind of put more on the charitable philanthropic end in people's minds of how they could make a difference for folks like me. So I'm here from a really personal place today because I think this conversation is super important for girls who grew up in rural parts of the country like myself, who were kind of given the narrative of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, while a lot of donors didn't look to necessarily funding the systems that could drive some of that change. And I'm also here because I think that it's really important for us to implement new practices within the institutions that we touch and have reach and have access to. So now that I'm in the position that I am in, coming still with a lot of privilege to arrive in the space and work in philanthropy and understanding that myself as an educated white woman, I think it's really important that we push on our institutions to get more interested in investing in spaces and in work from a justice framework, from a justice mindset. So hopefully today's conversation will prompt some new questions for you, will really challenge you to think differently about the work that you're doing, and will hopefully help you feel brave enough to take some of these questions and learnings back and really invest in some changes within your organization to move closer to embracing a justice mindset and a justice practice. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and get us started. So I'm going to take you through two things today. The first thing is I'm going to walk you through a really quick snapshot. It's not the full history of philanthropy. We're going to go from basically at the end of the Civil War up until the moment that we're in today, look at 100+ years or so of the philanthropic movement, to understand the roots of where philanthropy comes from, and to also just kind of, I think, be in awe of how much it has changed, but also to be in awe in the same capacity of how much it hasn't changed and how much work there really still is for us to do to move this sector forward, to really embrace ideas around equity and justice. And then towards the end of the conversation, I'm going to plop in a couple of questions for you all from Darren's book. For anyone who is watching this or attending today who has not yet read the book, or who has listened to the book, because it's available on audio on the Ford Foundation's website fully, that's totally okay. I'm going to share some snippets for a context of having a conversation. And I hope that coming out of today, it really inspires you to invest and learn more. So let's walk really quickly, doing a little, just a sort of a brief history of philanthropy. So very much coming out of the Civil War, philanthropy was in response to community needs around the turn of the century. We see a Western model of philanthropy and giving implemented globally. And so much of what we start to see happening in the philanthropic sector in the United States coming out of this moment is really culturally disconnected from many of the cultures that philanthropy is sort of, quote, walking into around the world. And I'll get into later in the presentation today how that's really problematic and how important it is for us all to really focus our work more on embracing very, very different and wonderful cultural norms throughout the globe. Around this time, Andrew Carnegie, who is accruing massive wealth in this moment, releases a publication called The Gospel of Wealth. And this is what Darren Walker really draws a lot of his inspiration and sort of perspective from in this moment. And Andrew Carnegie really wrote in this moment about the need for us to start, for individuals and families to start investing more of their wealth in solving societal problems, and thinking about how someone who has wealth and opportunity can really invest in solutions at a larger scale really creating more change than just necessarily doing charitable work in the world. So again, it's kind of that many of you, I'm sure, have heard that sort of it's more important to teach a man to fish than to sort of hand him a fish to feed for a lifetime and not just for a day. And so this is where we see some of that sort of first start to be discussed and talked about and really implemented and institutionalized in foundation structures at the moment that Andrew Carnegie releases this publication. The next thing that we see is women at the community level really driving and making a difference, and men are sort of working more nationally and globally in their philanthropy work. So this is one of the times that we first start to see women with wealth making change in a much more grassroots, community-driven way. A lot of the organizations that women are involved in philanthropically at this moment in time are local schools and local hospitals in their communities, while we see men really working on more sort of nationwide or global solutions to the different issues that they're tackling. And we see this happen sort of at all different levels, both private and public sector. We also see the first private family foundation be birthed. This is, again, the time when sort of foundations as a structure are being formalized, and the idea of investing deeply in your community and, kind of creating an endowment, a perpetual endowment that's going to exist for a long time is created. And so the Russell Sage Foundation is the first private family one that we see pop into the landscape. And then lastly, if there was kind of, sort of one word to characterize this era that we're looking at to start off in philanthropy, it's really responsive and sort of recovery. So maybe perhaps, coming out of the Civil War, sort of starting to establish new practices to look at innovation and education. This moment in philanthropy is sort of very responsive to a lot of needs, and going into the 1930s and 1940s, we see it start to formalize even more as people take a lot of those key learnings from just being reactive in philanthropy and start to institutionalize best practices and create new structures. So next up, if we look at kind of this next chunk of time that I put together for the sake of today's conversation and presentation, a big thing we see happen in the 1930s is President Roosevelt passes the Social Security Act. And this really has a big impact on philanthropy because it's the first time that we're really seeing sort of economic security through both a government and a philanthropic lens come together, and people are thinking about what does it look like for all of these different vehicles to work together around a goal such as supporting the elderly and supporting the disadvantaged in this particular moment in time. We also, in this era, get to see that, the Great Depression didn't end philanthropy. It actually inspired a lot of funding of the arts. So I think we're actually seeing that in this moment as well. We're seeing a lot of funding pop up to sort of preserve arts and culture coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so maybe a parallel to the Great Depression, we see that philanthropy is first really taking a deep interest in funding the arts and innovation. We also see in this era, probably coming out of right around World War II, and probably sparked by what was the lived experience and what Americans bore witness to in that moment. But we see a lot of international giving. And we also start to see collaboration beginning in philanthropy. So again, wanting to tackle bigger problems, wanting to find global solutions, we start to see philanthropists collaborate, when prior to this moment, a lot of it was still sort of happening in silos. At this time, we also have the establishment, this is going into the 60s and 70s, of tribal-based philanthropy and corporate philanthropy. Today, you can trace all the way back to those early roots of the tribal-based philanthropic movement. Today, you can see it in communities like Native Americans in philanthropy and a lot of the tribal-based philanthropic giving circles throughout the country, and corporate philanthropy at the same time. So again, as corporations start to have more power, start to see the opportunities they have to give back to their workforce and their local communities, recognizing their struggles, we also sort of start to see corporate philanthropy formalize. We see something kind of interesting happen with the Julius Rosenwald Fund that I think is important to note as we go into the rest of today's conversation. This was a trust that dissolved really quickly. They didn't like the idea of perpetual endowments, and so they were the first fund in Chicago, like really big fund that was birthed in Chicago at the time. And what happened kind of during this moment for them is this trust really quickly dissolved, and then all of a sudden there were still needs in the community, and it was no longer there, nor also influencing philanthropy in the same capacity that it was prior to it giving away its entire corpus. So this was a really interesting kind of like case study where people first started to say, like, what is the role of funds and foundations? How do they dissolve? How do they continue to exist? And sort of, how do you assess a lot of that, that need going forward? And as I'll mention later in the presentation, often you can answer that question by simply connecting to the local community and finding out what the short and long-term needs are, and trusting them to fund in that trajectory. So there's an interesting kind of case study in philanthropy that made people pause and go, how do we structure this going forward? We also see philanthropy used as a tool to combat communism, which happened around the Cold War. The Ford Foundation defines its global mission for the first time. Again, for today's conversation, Darren Walker is the current head of the Ford Foundation. And so we'll hear a little bit more about him and sort of his trajectory and understanding of the foundation up until this moment. We see a lot of philanthropists funding the civil rights movement. Again, for the context of today's dialogue, a lot of what Darren Walker writes about is also informed by Martin Luther King Jr.'s perspective on philanthropy and perspective as a fundraiser. I think oftentimes people forget that Martin Luther King Jr. actually had to be a really powerful and successful fundraiser to build the movement that he built. And so he had a lot of thoughts about how that work was funded, and that's echoed in Darren's book. And then lastly, the Open Society Foundation and George Soros established themselves also with a long-term vision, which that vision very much still holds today, even though they've gone through a variety of different restructuring and focus areas over the years. This is where we see, again, bigger entities like Ford, OSF, Rockefeller family partners, a lot of these big foundations, a lot of these bigger entities really saying, we have a mission and a vision. And in many ways, they're sort of institutionalizing and setting up for the first time. So I like to kind of characterize this last sort of chunk in time, the 30s to the 80s that we talked about, as really being about innovation and investing in innovation. So it was really a time where, again, it's not just investing in innovation out in the field per se, but also innovating who philanthropy is and how it functions. So this is where, again, like corporate philanthropy kind of starts to bubble up. We start to see people really say, like, how should we structure this? What's the right fund, foundation, trust? How do we use this as a tool and create resource flow to our communities where we really want to see change happen? So this was a time where it was very innovative, kind of both in what philanthropy was investing in, but also it was innovative in terms of folks starting to look and try and really explore new and different models for structuring their wealth so they could solve societal problems. All right, so now we're in the 80s, the era that I was lucky enough to be born in. I remember many a fond shoulder pad and scrunchie from my mom's days, from the 80s up until basically today, up until last year. And so what kind of some of the things that we need to look at in this moment is the first thing I think really important to note is this is the first time we see philanthropy as kind of a career path, right? Like there's an opportunity. It's like it's all of a sudden become this professional formalized field, and it really goes global. So over these decades that we're looking at now, that's something that really happens while still connected and rooted in traditions. We really see philanthropy rise up as a sector and professionalize. We see tremendous growth in nonprofits. There are so many nonprofits that are birthed in the 80s and 90s. And for the sake of today's conversation, especially here in Maine, we see a big boom in the number of nonprofits established in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of that is encouraged, again, by resource and innovation. So as things become accessible to folks and as sort of certain innovations are being put at the forefront, we see a tremendous growth in nonprofits really wanting to try new things. And I also think it's important for the context of our dialogue today to just remember that many nonprofits, for those of us who were, sort of working in philanthropy, when we're in positions of power around making decisions where resources flow to, it's really important for us to remember that nonprofits are innovators. you know, they're exploring, they're experimenting, they're working to try to figure out what's the best way to serve their community and their planet, and how to show up. And so it's really important that we create that culture and that environment where people feel open and comfortable and confident in doing that type of work with their donor partners, their funder partners. Venture philanthropy is established, sort of the venture capital model arrives in philanthropy. We see a lot of philanthropists, and Darren references a few in his book, who start for the first time kind of putting $5, $10, $15 million investments into new models of philanthropy. They're not just necessarily big gifts going to institutions, but really investing in a sort of venture capital way. We also see global models for philanthropy deepen and impact the United States. So during this time, we start to see in the European market, the African Philanthropy Forum is birthed. We sort of start to see all these other folks throughout the globe getting more involved in the philanthropic conversation. We also see a rise in women's philanthropy and donor organizing. During this time, several different women donors networks are birthed, everything from the Women Donors Network to the Women's Funding Network to Women Moving Millions, to a variety of different women's giving circles. We really see women as they're sort of rising in the workforce, to also start to take ownership of their wealth and resources and create a different impact, and have a different approach, not very different though from sort of the community roots that I referenced a little bit earlier in today's presentation. We also see a lot of donor organizing, and I think this kind of rose up in tandem with women's philanthropy. We see a lot of women, this is where big organizations like Save the Children start to have chapters, and women are, you know, hosting house parties and convening in groups and raising and organizing themselves to hit certain goals around certain community goals, community fundraising goals and needs. And there's sort of like this rising up of really community-centric and collaborative funding. National Philanthropy Day is established. Don't need to rest too long on there, but the day is established to honor and recognize philanthropy. And then next up we have, you know, Nelson Mandela points out to us how important it is to democratize all systems. And this is where we start to see people really thinking about, okay, what does that mean for philanthropy? How do we democratize philanthropy? How do we get more people involved? And necessarily just the people who have their, bless you, whoever just sneezed. And we definitely start to see more people pushing to democratize the philanthropic sector. Giving circles, we see a lot of we see a lot of groups established for collective decision making at some very traditional foundation structures. We see employees more engaged in philanthropy, and that again sort of bleeds into this next point where corporate philanthropy just flourishes. From 2000 on, corporate philanthropy has been on the rise and gives away billions and billions of dollars every year. And we really see a lot of that encouraged by the millennial generation, which I'm very proud to be a part of, where we start to see sort of millennials as they're going into the workplace, really pushing for more social impact to be part of the fabric of their experience as an employee, and not just necessarily something one-off that the company does once a year, but really thinks about how companies can make a deep impact. At this time, we also see a lot of sort of messaging start to come out as we're learning about what's happening to our planet with climate change and with the climate. And we start to see a lot of messaging coming out that's sort of talking about the role that corporations are playing in that and how they really need to get back to sustainability and to ensure that they're not doing harm when they're funding funding on the other side. So really kind of we start to see this conversation bubble up within the corporate philanthropic sector, and we really start to see all different types of funds, awards, initiatives, employee giving platforms, foundations be birthed in this moment. The Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett launched the Giving Pledge, which is a platform for billionaires to sign up to give away the majority of their wealth while they're living. And so this is a really important moment where individuals are really called upon to step up and do as much as possible in this moment. And it's also, you know, it's kind of a very public platform to challenge other billionaires, as we're seeing the rise of the billionaire class, to talk about some of the really profound information that's coming out about economic inequality, which I'll share a little bit more about on the next few slides. And then to kind of just wrap up, you know, few charitable trusts shift to being a public charity, which I think is important to note because we start to see many organizations after this kind of fall in line to also start doing more lobbying, more fundraising, more mobilizing. And we start to see a rise in funding advocacy in tandem to funding, again, charitable work. And this is, again, for the sake of today's conversation, how we really see starting to make a difference in the system, right? So people start to think about what are all of the different public, private, government partnerships and everything that kind of needs to go in to really address an issue, because you can't just be funding something on one side or passing policy on the other side and not really all collaborating to try to create the changes that we want to see. Technology plays a big role in this era, which probably won't surprise you. Crowdfunding emerges. We see Giving Tuesday, the 24-hour giving days. And then we also see, this is empowering a whole new sort of generation of young people to feel like philanthropists and to really claim their philanthropy. And so this is where we sort of start to see people kind of, fight against the traditional notion of, Warren Buffett, sort of older males, older wealthy males or older, older, more established folks can just be philanthropists, after they're done working, and this give while you live mentality sort of comes in. And we see that really take us up until today, and that is very much still alive in the moment that we're in. And then we also start to see, I think with climate change, some urgency coming from philanthropy to really figure out what the solutions are. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN put out as kind of a countdown to 2030, and really thinking about like how can we achieve some of these large goals that we have around well-being for people and planet. And so we see a lot of prize structures emerge because people are trying to really encourage folks to innovate, to experiment, and ultimately to focus on impact. So up until this last moment, sort of if we look at the 80s up until 2021, as we stand here today, so much of the work and emphasis that I see now with donors is about having impact and creating sustainable impact. And what does that mean? I see that's in a variety of different ways, right? So we see everything from organizations starting to really value both anecdotal data, the stories about transformation and how people's lives are changing, in addition to the numbers on the spreadsheet and how many people are going through a program or graduating from something. We really start to see people thinking about how they measure data differently, how they view impact differently. And we also see people kind of embracing the discomfort, which kind of goes into the next part of our conversation, but embracing the discomfort that this work won't be finished in our lifetime, right? So this idea that impact work takes a long time, that it's not just about outputs within a 1, 2, 3 year sort of cycle, but that we're really having to focus and shift our mindset to say, what are we doing together over the next decade? Or what are we doing together over the next several decades? And so a lot of that has really impacted philanthropy. I think it's gotten folks to think a lot more about long-term trajectory and the work that they're doing and the partnerships they're creating. And so that kind of leads us up to this question today. And I know we have Kelsey, Tori, Suzanne, and Robert. Feel free to chime in for those of you that are with us. But I'm curious, and I say aspiring because I think we're all always trying to be our best in philanthropy and align our values with our resources. So I'm curious if there's anyone who wants to kind of chime in, but I'm curious where your focus today sort of lies as an aspiring philanthropist, and if there's anything that I shared, up until this moment that really relates to you, or that you feel like, I can see that coming out of COVID, or any examples or anything for you that really points to where your focus might be right now as an aspiring philanthropist in the world.
I can take a stab if you want, Alyssa.
Yeah, join on in, Suzanne.
So I'm thinking about, I'm at the main philanthropy event, specifically supporting an organization called Cobb's Cook Institute, which is in Washington County. But my work is largely around building donor collaboratives and looking at the self-determination and rights of both local communities, but with more of a focus on looking at who's been historically marginalized. In any particular community, there may be like a mainstream and a margin, and actually looking at community well-being and how to allow communities to self-determine their own path forward with equity and inclusion as a lens. So I think that falls a little more into responsive, because it's inviting, whether it be a geographic community or a global community of practice, it's inviting communities to actually come together in a facilitated way that is adaptable to many learning and knowledge styles, to look to what their deepest needs might be in order to achieve their greatest unleashing of potential. But I think that in order to be responsive, we have to really think with an eye for innovation, because some of the frameworks that we've used before really come from, as you were describing, that whole period around like the 30s to the 80s, which is a remarkably long period of time. A lot of, I was like, figures of millennial would put like the 30s to the 80s, and then the 80s.
Presentations are fun. You got an hour to put a whole.
Great. Actually, I just learned a lot, and that was really good. And I'm thinking about like how philanthropy really was, for the most part, born out of a business mindset with intention to do things differently, but still has those underpinnings. And so what's worked for corporate may not actually work in the entangled, nonlinear environment of a community, right? And we've missed the opportunity to support that value. And so what are innovations that allow non-monetary value to also surface itself? And I think that actually then builds into the notion of impact, because I think we've been identifying impact something from an externalized lens. But if we allow communities and people to think, what is valued for us and what is meaningful for us, I think we get much more enduring, sustained positive changes than if we sort of, anyway, so those are the kinds of frameworks that my firm Cattail Strategy is looking at, while Copps Cook Institute in Washington County is one very, very good example of practice around building from the community up in terms of what's valued. So that's what I'd say.
I love how you tied in kind of all three as being necessary and important in some capacity. And I think that what you named, and I know your work a little bit, so I can comment on this, but I think also being responsive to the community need, and not necessarily just responsive to kind of, I feel like a lot of philanthropy up until this moment has been very like, even right now, like we sort of see with recovery from COVID, there's like this blanket of like, we need economic recovery. We need to help people recover. But every single community is going to have a different interpretation of what it means to be economically stable, to find jobs, to feel economic justice. So being responsive to the specific community that you're working with or that you're a part of. And then what I also like that you shared is that it doesn't mean that innovation like isn't necessary, but it's a different type of innovation. And it's not innovation that necessarily is always birthed out of where philanthropy was originally birthed, which was really from these, these moguls, these big personalities who accrued their wealth in the corporate space. And so really thinking about like, who are maybe some of those innovators that are unseen right now that we can look to. So I love you sharing that. I don't know, Victoria Stanton, are you on the call? Do you want to chime in and kind of maybe in your own philanthropy or what you see in this moment where the focus lies for aspiring philanthropists or the sector?
Can you hear me?
Thoughts for you? I can. Chime on in.
Oh,
welcome.
I was having a little issue. I'll try to start my video too. I was having a little bit of an issue with my mic, so I wasn't sure if I could offer anything. I think I don't know how this connects deeply to anything else, that we're talking about, but I keep thinking about this idea of philanthropy as an identity for people who, they step into some of the work that we're doing from a very personal place, and it's sort of a badge. It's sort of something that you wear, and it's something that you're demonstrating sort of, values through, and in that way, you're kind of catching me a little off guard. I don't have a really great answer formulated, but for the work that I do in domestic violence, being, a gender-based social justice issue, we haven't necessarily had a decades-long trajectory interacting with philanthropy and philanthropists. That we're doing, at least in Maine, is very newer to us when you talk about real philanthropic programming and working with donors and seeing ourselves in that space. And so I think what I'm seeing, a lot of what we're trying to do is kind of all the things at once, trying to meet donors where they're at, also be true to our values, because seeing, innovation and impact as defined by the people we served, and trying to center that, educational component that we're doing with ourselves, with our donors, at every turn in the conversations.
I like what you just said about also kind of bringing it back to ourselves in terms of our own personal work and our own personal, and I think that's a good sort of segue to talk about the moment that we're in today, right? So my goodness, in my own private practice, working with families and working with individuals who are high net worth and exploring this philanthropic space, I think it's so important that we just, really in this moment in time, recognize how many people are really thinking about wealth as one, I think more of an expansive, right? So sort of this, like the all different types of the polycapital idea, right? There's all different types of capital, all different types of wealth. How do we bring that to our work? And why do we, how and why do we value financial capital as part of what we're doing over intellectual or social or spiritual, and all these different types of capital we can all bring to philanthropy and own that identity and speak from a place of being peers and being supportive. And then I also think there's a conversation, because we are sitting in a moment of just vast income inequality, to really think about if we shift to this justice mindset, if we really move along this continuum from more charitable giving to justice giving, what does that mean as we're kind of looking in this moment? Who are we questioning? What kind of discomfort are we embracing, and how are we challenging some traditional, more traditional power structures or understandings of power than we've had up until this moment? And that's a tricky word, right? Like we don't necessarily talk a whole lot about power. I remember, maybe 5 or 7 years ago, writing case statements for organizations. They literally said to me, "Oh, don't put the word power building or power in it, because that's a difficult place. Just put empowerment or put leadership, but don't talk about actually an exchange of power, or thinking about that as part of the world that we see possible." But there's so much truth in that, in terms of us needing to talk about power. And, what I'll put in here today is I think those are the conversations that are really, truly happening in philanthropy that are exciting, as well as very scary and uncomfortable for many of us, whether at our institutions or within our own families, and how we have that dialogue. We're challenging traditional concepts, and that's a lot of what Darren Walker does in his book. Of this idea of power. And so the conversation's really happening today in 2021 and going into next year, I'm sure, are really about how we decolonize wealth, a publication that came out by Edgar Villanueva, and looking about how we decolonize the whole concept of wealth and thinking about where our wealth came from, and really sort of assessing how we move it towards a vision of society that is decolonized, and what does that look like. Also really thinking about, there was also Anand Girohata's publication on why there are so many billionaires. His book, Winners Take All, really addresses that question. So looking at the idea of how, again, and I can tell you from my own work, how many times when I was working with organizations, particularly in East Africa, when I was working there at the time, how many organizations or entities, whether they were private family foundations or large corporations, would sort of have a harmful practice as part of their business model. But then over here in their philanthropy, they were doing something, charitable to kind of, offset the harm they were doing by way of making their business. And so I think that there's a lot of conversations about that. How do we do less harm? How do we create new structures? How do we empower people on more of a grassroots level? And I think a lot of that has to do with, we look at communities like Philanthropy Together. They actually had their conference last week. I have my little I Love My Giving Circle, because I'm a part of a few giving circles and love that practice. But how do we democratize philanthropy? How do we really move it forward so that, again, as Suzanne chimed in and referenced earlier in the presentation, we're really empowering people in the community to make the decisions around where the resources and assets and capital flow to make a difference. And so we're involving everyone in the conversation and giving them a seat at the table. There's also really interesting work, because for so long we've thought that philanthropy was a bunch of retired older white males with a lot of wealth, because that's, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, all these names that we know in philanthropy. And so it's really important that we recognize that there has been philanthropic practice, even probably deeper roots in philanthropic practice. I definitely think there have been in many communities of color, in many communities of women, in many of the more marginalized communities in our society. And so there's movements like the work that Holly Lee is doing with the Donors of Color Network, where it's really saying, who are the donors we're not seeing because of our own bias, and who actually is very philanthropic, but we leave out of our conversations. And then again, just to kind of start and kick us off on talking about Darren's book, you know, how do we move from generosity to justice? So when Andrew Carnegie wrote his publication, that was in the Gilded Age, the late 1880s, a time when there were these huge corporate tycoons living lives of luxury, and there were many people across the country that were suffering from unfair wages and poor living conditions. And so if we look at today, in today's America, we actually have a very similar dynamic. We have vast income inequality, and Darren calls it in his book, it's the new Gilded Age. We're in a position where 4,000 of the richest families own as much wealth as a little over 11 million families combined in our country. And we have this rise of the billionaire class, which some people predict will be the trillionaire class in the next couple of years. Let's hope not. But there's sort of this rising of income inequality, and it prompts the question of where do we go from here? And I think that Darren's book is really addressing and saying to philanthropy, where do we go from here to move on that continuum from generosity to justice? So what I'll just name right here is this is a time for deep reflection. I had the great gift and opportunity of being on a panel a few weeks ago with Nick Tedesco, who's the head of the National Center for Family Philanthropy. And he kind of called in, which I think is really important in this moment, families are in a deep place of reflection. And really family foundations especially are really thinking about who are we and how do we move through this moment in time that we're in, you know, as part of the 1%. So that being said, I think it's really important that while there is the you know, amazing and really important, generous and charitable, you know, mindset that we have as Americans, it's also really important that we recognize that we do a deep disservice if we don't balance all of those generous acts with equal commitments to justice. And as a former scholarship kid myself, I can share about that from a really, you know, story-driven place. You know, so again, it was, you know, I was loved on by this one particular donor at the high school that I went to because part of her gift was part of my scholarship to be able to go to that school because I was, you know, that I was going to at the time. But I remember a few years after I graduated college, I had remembered that she was one of the donors that reached out to me. And I reached out to her and I said, hey, I just graduated. I have my bachelor's degree. You know, I know your kids went to my school too. And, you know, we connected over the years. And I had asked her if she knew of any leads for, you know, for a potential job. Or I said, you know, would you share my resume around? Do you think there's anyone I should know? And I remember her saying, oh, that's great, honey. Good luck with everything. But I've got a lot going on right now. And, you know, so you know, I'm not, you know, here's a couple, you know, places to look in town. And so I just remember feeling this feeling of like, wait a minute, like, I thought the whole trajectory was going to be about giving me access and opportunity, not just what one particular moment during my life trajectory. And so I think there's something to be said for reflecting right now around our consistency and commitment to those that we serve, to the fact that the individuals that we support, the planet that we're trying to protect isn't a siloed sort of, you know, one-off charitable moment that we have and then we move on. It's really important to be consistent. And it's also really important to focus, not, again, problematic to focus on the short term, but it's also really important that we think of all of ourselves in this sort of place of being explorers, being entrepreneurs, being highly experimental. I always think about philanthropy as an experiment. And Darren makes this great point in his book that it's not, there's no experts. You know, no one's lived coming out of a global pandemic with deep reckoning around racial injustice, with you know, the planetary issues that we have right now, trying to mitigate climate change, with you know, with all of the complexities of this moment that we're in. No one's lived in this moment, and so we all have to be really open to listening and learning and experimenting together. And so I think that there's a certain level of humility that requires in this moment, and I feel really grateful that there are a lot of families and individuals that I get to partner with who are doing this work, doing this work where you have to kind of heal yourself to go out and heal the world. And so it's really important that you create that space for self-reflection, whether you're joining today's conversation or listening to this recording from a place of being a program officer at a foundation, or being a director at a corporate philanthropy program, or being an individual donor who has either inherited or self-generated wealth and the ability to move it towards impact. So I think one of the most important questions to kind of answer for yourself as you start on this journey from moving from generosity to justice is, what's a challenge that you've really faced in your life? What is something that you've had to move through, and who or what helped you through it? And how do you kind of start to assess the vehicles and the individuals and the mechanisms that have showed up, so you start to understand the system that exists and the necessity that there is for all of us to be more self-aware of what's actually helped us get to this point, recognize our privileges in that, but then also bring it into the dynamics of the philanthropic entity or the family that we're a part of. How do we really bring that attitude and idea of humility and vulnerability to the forefront before we start deciding on our systems and structures and grantees? So if we go chapter by chapter through Darren's book, I'm going to take about the next 10 minutes and just chat a little bit about elements of the book. But one of the first chapters is really about the privilege of perspective. So seeing and sharing access and opportunity. So often we sort of, I worked with a donor for a really long time who he told me that he was like, I'm self-made. I made all this, money on my own. It's my, I had no, sort of no support, grew up without any support. No one encouraged me. And so this whole idea of like sort of being self-made or being successful is really being challenged in this moment by folks as they sort of start to look at the entire system and to invest more in causes versus necessarily consequences of the world that we're in. So that being shared, one of the great sort of little tidbits that comes out of Darren's book is he interviews Jeff Rakes of the Rakes Foundation, who was the former CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And he talks a lot about this idea of really recognizing the privilege that you have and not getting sucked into feeling in some way that you're entitled to choose what's best for society. I moved up here to Maine 7 years ago from Western Massachusetts. Working with the communities I worked with of women and girls in Western Massachusetts is dramatically different than working with the communities of young girls that I now work with through the programs I partner with in Southern Maine. So it's very different, and there's a certain level of vulnerability and honesty that you need to bring to that work. And you also need to be really aware of your privilege as you're moving through your organization and making decisions. For a really long time, I thought because I grew up working class poor and struggled to get an education that, I was always going to be the poor kid, right? And I painted myself that way in a lot of conversations that I had, not recognizing that I was an educated extrovert, a white woman, very articulate. I had all of these other things that were part of my identity that gave me a lot of privilege. And so as we go through chapter by chapter, I think it's important for you to think about what are some of the questions you can bring back to your institution that may be between, selecting grantees or between your, spreadsheets and all the other things you have kind of going on and managing within the organization. You can start to sort of pepper in to your practices. So maybe one of the questions to pose at your next team meeting or your next board gathering is, who or what has enabled each of us to be successful in this life and to be able to be a volunteer service or to have these jobs or to be in these positions? Having open-ended conversations like this and actually listening and hearing from your colleagues is really important, because you all kind of have to start doing this really difficult and often uncomfortable work together of assessing how we've all arrived to this moment, and what voices we've kept from having access and opportunities. So that's kind of one of the first things we see Darren assess in the book. One of the next chapters I'll just kind of highlight, and again, there's full links at the end of today's presentation for you to go and listen to Darren's book. All the audio is available on the Ford Foundation's website, or you can purchase it and read it as well. But the awareness of ignorance. So recognizing that there's a whole lot that we don't know. So to kind of go back to earlier, thinking about the moment that we're in, how many people have done this work, again, coming out of a global pandemic, living with vast income inequality, facing the childcare circumstances that I'm just recognizing we have, a lot of women right now who work in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector who have been struggling the last year. So there's so much, so much that we just don't know. And so we have to embrace this work as explorers, experimenters, really coming into it with an entrepreneurial lens and not being afraid to say, you know what, I don't know that, but let's figure it out together. I also think it's really important, to kind of check your own biases. Darren uses this example in his book of being an able-bodied person and being so blind to the problems that disabled people face. And often because he thought that he was, both Black and gay, that he thought that this discrimination kind of, ended there for himself. So similar to my example that I shared on the previous slide of, I thought that just because I grew up working poor and I was a woman that I didn't have any privilege, when yet I was white and super educated and very articulate, grew up in America, and was an extrovert. So I was a serial connector. I'll never be for want of relationships and connections because of my nature. And so all of these different types of things are part of our privilege. And so it's really important that we're not afraid to go into conversations within our institutions, within our families, within our own journals, because some of you might be arriving to this presentation as individual donors and philanthropists, but asking ourselves, what do I still not know and where can I learn? I also think for anyone who is working with a foundation, or you have foundations that fund your work and you're on today's call, I think it's important to drop this kind of idea and to create that sort of learning environment with your grant makers or with your institution that is making grants. So again, a best practice might be, hey, every quarter when we have our team retreat or, on our weekly calls, what do we still not know about our grantees? What could we learn from them? So often I've sat in so many meetings at foundations where kind of the program directors and the CEO are going around talking, and they're like, oh, we have to do this. We need to get that from them. We need them to answer this. And so how do we shift that power dynamic a little bit to really asking, where can I still learn? What do I need to learn from my grantees? What do they need from us? What do I not know? So really shifting the power dynamic a little bit and thinking about how you can change that by way of some of the structures within your organization. The next kind of chapters to look at a little bit, again, I'm not taking you through every chapter of the book today, but just the ones I think are important for the sake of a little bit of a discussion in a few minutes, is the ownership of selflessness and really giving with humility. So I struggle with this a lot, particularly as someone who has been designing planned giving and legacy programs with organizations over the years. But really, a lot of, and especially when working with a lot of families, there's sort of that mentality of, I want my legacy to live on. Like, I want people to remember me. I really want to make sure, that if, how much do I have to give to get my name on that, or to have that center being, honored by my family. And there's sort of that feeling of, again, it's more of a little bit of more of an ego-driven, how am I honored, versus what's best for the community as I'm giving my wealth and putting it back into it. It's this idea of collective leadership. We're all in this together. I want to welcome in that idea also too of polycapital, and the idea that while someone might have the financial resources to make something to come to fruition, there are many people in the community that deserve the same recognition for their intellectual, social, emotional, spiritual, physical capital that all go into making this work happen, because no one truly does it alone. Having the financial resources to do it is a part of it, but it's not all of it. And so how do we shift to giving more with humility and recognizing that within our organization? And then one of the other things, I love this, the venture capitalist example that Darren gives in his book, but just really this idea of thinking about how do we address causes and not consequences. So as someone who has raised money for domestic violence work for the majority of my career, one of my first organizations I ever worked with was fundraising for a domestic violence shelter. And I remember someone saying to me, we can never get to funding prevention in this space because we're always just funding the needs of survivors, because that's the line item that we are in a lot of foundations and corporate foundations and individuals, budget or mindset. It was very much about helping the individual survivor versus saying, okay, how much do we need to really transform the system? And so it's really important that we think a lot about not just addressing consequences, while that is really important, we need to think abundantly. We need to think about, if we look back at our history of modern philanthropy that we talked about up until this moment, we really need to look at, the idea of collaborative philanthropy. What's possible if we all pooled our resources to address more causes together? What if we drew down from the corpus to actually start investing in systems change? There's so many ways in which we can make capital flow with the billions of dollars that are accessible to all of us in some capacity every single year to start to address more systemic causes. And the organizations and the individuals who I see in the philanthropy world who are really moving on that trajectory to embracing more of a justice mindset and funding a vision for the world that is really equitable and fair, are consistently balancing, usually funding both in some capacity, but really, really making sure that they're addressing systemic causes in what they're doing. So I'm going to pause here, and there are many more chapters to Darren Walker's book, From Generosity to Justice, that you can explore. I think it's really helpful to read, Lauren Powell-Jobs, Jeff Rakes, Carly Hare, many philanthropic leaders in the book share their stories of kind of, waking up or recognizing the moment around some of these things, that it was really important for them to shift how they saw the world and how they thought about their resources and wealth and power and all the things they had access to, making a difference. But I just want to kind of land on these few things that, Darren sort of sums up at the end of the book, which is we really need to first and foremost recognize the privilege of perspective by seeing and sharing access and opportunity. People often ask me a lot in the work that I do in the world, why haven't you been an executive director or a CEO yet? Or why haven't you taken a leadership position? And I personally feel as a white woman in the social justice movement that much of my role is opening doors and windows and giving access and opportunity to other people and not necessarily leading them. This is a really hard thing to kind of reckon with and think about, and everyone has a different perspective on it and how they arrive in the work. But for me, so much of what I feel, the space that I occupy, is being the door opener, is being the person to give the access and opportunity to those who traditionally haven't been there. And I try to do that in my work, both personally and professionally. And then the next thing is adopt the awareness of ignorance by learning what we don't know. I end almost every single conversation when I'm working with someone around, what else do I need to know? What else can you share with me today? How did today's conversation feel? Is there anything that you want to share with me around our partnership? Is it working for you? What's working? What isn't? You have to create space to do this work well too. So it's really important that you don't, schedule in a grantee or talk to a partner that you have for 30 minutes and think that that's actually going to be a good enough space and time for you to really listen and learn, because listening and learning is key. Next up is take ownership of selflessness by giving with humility. So we talked a little bit about that on some of the previous slides. But I also think, that's a really important thing. I follow, oh my gosh, what is it called? I follow someone on Twitter called the whiny donor, like they're whining all the time. And it's interesting because they've started to have this counter movement of people kind of, responding to them saying, do you know how busy organizations are? Like people are literally trying to save lives and mitigate climate change and protect people and planet. And you're complaining that, you didn't get a thank you card within 7 days of making a donation. So just, kind of check and recognize yourself in those moments. And also don't be afraid to tell someone that you're feeling a certain way, right? So a lot of my own anti-racism practice for myself and, trying to move through the world is also being vulnerable and okay with people telling me that I've screwed up so then I can course correct. It's just really important that once you know better, you do better. And you hear a lot of that echoed throughout Darren Walker's book, accepting that sort of vulnerable state, whether for yourself or for your organization. I can tell you right now that I walk into a lot of foundations and I can immediately tell whether the culture is one that embraces mistake making and risk taking or does not. And so how can you be a little bit of a rebel or a revolutionary within your organization if you feel like that's something they need to move towards. The last few, just because I'm being mindful of time, is work to raise the roots by addressing causes, not consequences. We just talked about that. Harnessing the power of proximity by valuing both expertise and experience. No one ever invited me as the scholarship kid at 17 years old to be a part of anything that was decision making, because there were experts out there who knew what was better for me. So I think it's really important. A lot of the organizations I work with now, I actually talk to them about, from my own experience, making a youth committee. How are you centering youth voices in the work that you're doing? If you're working to support young people, why aren't they part of the decision-making process, and just the ones that you're maybe, platforming on the stage or, cheerleading in your newsletters. So really thinking about, giving value and weight to that experience part. Exercise the courage of conviction by standing up and speaking out. Put yourself on the line. Take a risk. I always tell myself that I hope at some point that I will be sort of gently moved on, or I will exit myself from the philanthropic sector in the next couple of decades. And my husband and I joke that we have dreams of just doing some farming and things like that, maybe. But how are you moving yourself through the field? What risks are you taking? Are you stepping up and speaking out? Are you really challenging the system while you're also moving through it? And then lastly, promote the democracy of justice by recognizing that our liberation is bound together. So it's really important that we remember that equity is not a pie. Just because somebody else gets a piece of pie doesn't mean that you're not going to get to have a bite of pie too. And it's really important that we embrace an abundance mindset and remember that everyone sitting at the table just makes us stronger and better together. So I want to invite you to take a couple of actions. There's a cute puppy here in a bow tie, because some of these actions might be difficult for you personally. They might be difficult for you to approach your manager within your institution or the leader within your institution to take and start to change. But the first thing is to self-reflect. If you yourself haven't invested in your own healing journey, it's going to be really difficult for you to show up vulnerable in certain spaces to have these conversations, especially if it's your place of work. So what work do you still need to do? How do you still need to heal? And I think a great start to that process is listening to Darren Walker's story. So you can listen to From Generosity and Justice on the Ford Foundation's website, and also hear from other donors about the experience that they've gone through. Jeff Rakes and Lauren Powell Jobs in particular, I think, offer really compelling stories about embracing humility and taking risk. If you're looking for some organizational things, conduct an unbiased listening tour. Hire a third party, hire a part-time staff person, ask someone who's a volunteer to the organization but not in it, to go out and listen to your constituents and communities, to meet with your grantees. Don't send out a survey or think that what grantees are telling you as a program officer is necessarily accurate. They're petrified of losing their funding. They're probably not going to tell you the full truth. So conduct an unbiased listening tour, and there are ways you can head to our website, alissafwright.com, that we show you how to do that. Network with other philanthropists, stay in community. Don't stay in your own silo or within your own institution. Talk to other donors and other donor entities all across the country. I had a call last week with a family foundation from Utah and a family foundation from New Hampshire, all working on racial equity work together. And the dialogue that they had helped both of them to innovate and to think differently. Invest in positions and solutions to support your grantees. So I've been really excited lately to see the rise of a lot of foundations and organizations offering capacity building and self-care to their grantee partners. One of my clients actually in their budget now puts a line item of $5,000 into every grant that they give out to every organization to make sure that there's room for professional development, for buying the staff pizza, for taking a couple days off, whatever it might be. But we have to realize that people who run our organizations and who lead movements also need time for self-care and reflection, and we need to respect that and fund it. And then lastly, think about moving yourself into the right role in your organization or in your movement. So some of you might be leaving today's conversation thinking, wow, maybe it's really time for me to move to the left or move to the right or step down or whatever it might be within your institution. But I think it's really important that we challenge these ideas. And as someone who has very oftentimes said no to opportunities because I know they're not the right ones for me based on who I am and what relationship I have to that community, it's really difficult. I have a 2-year-old daughter and a mortgage, and I get nervous sometimes when I step aside and make space for others that I'm not going to be okay, whether it's financial or emotional or intellectually or whatever it might be. But don't be afraid to challenge yourself a little bit and embrace the discomfort of that, because you're looking at somebody who's been doing it for 14 years and I'm doing all right. So just trust in the community that you're building, trust in the vision you have for the world, and just know the right role that you play within your organization and within the movements that you care about. I'm going to wrap up with a Family Foundation example here. You can head to the website if you want to look at it. National Center for Family Philanthropy talks about how this one family foundation started to insert these questions within their family meetings and conversations, and they share on the website some of the structures they came out of it with. And then just landing on some resources for you today. So for those of you who are either watching the recording or if you're attending here directly, I'll take Q&A in a moment, but please email me at alyssa@wright.com any questions you have as a follow-up to today. I'm happy to share resources. I think this is a really important conversation for the future of our country and for our children's future. So I think we need to be mindful of that. I also feel like it's important to understand the history of philanthropy, and so you can head to History of Giving to see a brief overview of some of what I shared today. And then if you're anyone joining the call who's working with family foundations, because that's my particular niche in the work that I've done, look at some of the trends in family philanthropy on the National Center's website and share them in conversation with your clients. Even if you're a financial advisor or if you're a philanthropic advisor working for a larger firm, I think it's really helpful to start a dialogue with some of your clients about, look what's trending in the philanthropic sector. Look at what other families are doing. What do you think? How does this make you feel? How do you think we could have more impact together? Don't be afraid to start the conversation. So I'm going to stop my screen share. So that was a lot, and it's 2:07. So Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have till 2:15. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Well, I see we have Suzanne, Victoria, Laura, and Jennifer still with us. Does anyone have any questions or comments that you want to share? I appreciate you all being here today. I know there were a lot of sessions at once, so thank you for arriving in mine. No questions out there? Well, I will conclude, just because I know this is also being recorded. I want to just conclude by sharing, again, I'm not sure those of you who are arriving to this, working for family foundations or working for, any sort of more formal institution, but I'm really open to conversations about how to make some of these shifts within your organization, especially from the bottom up. I worked 5 years ago with a young administrative assistant at a private family foundation that completely transformed the culture of that and some of the strategies of that organization over the course of the 5 years that she worked with that family. So just don't feel powerless if you want to make some of these changes happen within your institution. They're small and subtle. One of our clients started their first year with simply writing thank you cards, making all of the trustee members write thank you cards to the grantees at the end of the year. For all of the work that they do in the world. And it was kind of a subtle shift, but it definitely started to open up a conversation around power and wealth and how we all do this work together. So please do reach out, be in touch, and I will stay on if there are remaining questions. But I know next up in the schedule is Latasha Brown, who is going to be amazing at 2:30 for a keynote. So everyone enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for being here with me. I hope to hear from some of you all.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was awesome. It was really good.
Thank you.
Thank you.